All right, so hi everyone, and very welcome to our next installment as part of our Governance and Compliance webinar series. Today's webinar is focusing on the re-registration submission management. My name is Ann Nguyen, and I'm the engagement consultant here at DVE. If you haven't heard about us or haven't worked with us previously, DVE has been providing solutions for over 15 years in the higher education sector, and we have worked with over 34 Australian universities, including TAFEs, private providers, and delivered over 100 projects in few business lines that include governance and compliance, organizational improvement, digital transformation, to name a few. And we do provide support in business process improvement, change management, and communications. So just a couple quick housekeeping notes for today. This session is recorded, as you can see. So if you don't like to be recorded, do feel free to leave. But we will share this recording with you after today's session so that you can distribute to other team members if someone has missed. And then as part of the webinar function, you will be on mute the whole time and you won't see each other, unfortunately, but you will be able to see us, the presenters, and there is a chat function that you can submit your questions or comments throughout the session. Having said that, we will have a dedicated time at the end for Q&A time. So if you could kind of wait for that to be covered at the end, or otherwise we have also received pre-submitted questions when you registered, and we will try our best to cover them through the presentation. But at the end, if anything that is not covered or we run out of time, we'll be able to send all the questions at the end with the recording after today's session. And of course, if you stay till the end, we do have special offers for you as a special attendee of today's webinar. So, all right, enough about us. So I'd like to introduce two of my colleagues who will be presenting the topic today. So I've got Danielle Baird, Principal Consultant, Governance and Compliance. She's got over 14 years of experience in higher education. She's been a member on numerous subcommittees of the academic board, have considerable experience as a secretary to various boards as well. She's also led and managed numerous re-registration, course accreditation, and course renewal registration projects, and she has extensive experience in leading compliance, risk management, and quality assurance activity. So welcome, Danny, and we call her Danny here in-house. We also have Claude Lasso, who is our project delivery manager. She's got over 13 years of experience in project management in both telecommunications and higher education sectors. And here at DVE, Claude has been leading multiple projects in governance and compliance, including TEQSA Registration, course, TEQSA Initial Registration, course reaccreditation, reviews, and governance review. And Claude also has extensive experience in learning and organizational development. And welcome, Claude. All right, so I think without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Claude, who will lead us through the presentation. Thank you so much, Claude.
Thanks, Anne. It's actually going to be me kicking off this presentation today, and then I will hand over to Claude, who will go through today's agenda. So you would have guessed today's presentation is on TEQSA re-registration submission management. So while today's webinar focused purely on re-registration, the project management methodology and tools that we are going through today can be modified to apply to initial registrations or to course renewal or course re-registration applications that you need to put through. So even though this is purely focused on re-registration, it will be beneficial for any sort of TEQSA applications that you do need to put in. So before we get into the agenda today, I just wanted to give you all a bit of insight into how the re-registration process has changed over the years and the impact that this has had on providers. So one of the common pitfalls we see when providers are preparing for re-registration is they assume it will be the exact same process and they'll be required to submit the exact same evidence as what they submitted previously. Now, for some providers, this was 7 years ago, or for others, it was even longer if they have been granted extensions for re-registration. So because of this, most providers would not have been required to submit evidence against the 2015 Higher Education Standards Framework, or the threshold standards, which has now been updated to the 2021 standards. So with the change in the standards, the evidence requirements have changed, and TEQSA, since they've been in place for a while now, over time they've refined their regulatory approach, and their expectations have also changed around what providers should be submitting and what evidence there should be in place. So providers get caught out because they assume that the evidence they submitted back when they were initially registered, or when they were last successfully re-registered, will continue to be sufficient. And they fail to adequately review and update those materials, including all their policies and procedures. So it's really crucial that anyone involved in the re-registration process doesn't wait for the re-registration process to kick in. There should be this attitude towards continuous improvement. So it's crucial that providers constantly conducting external referencing and ensuring that their evidence is in line with best practice, that you're mapping out what evidence you have against each of the standards in the HESF. So it's something we highly recommend that your board make sure every year they're getting some sort of report with mapping what evidence you have against the HESF to identify any gaps, because your corporate board is ultimately responsible for ensuring the provider is compliant with the legislation. One way to make this easier is to make sure along the way, when you're creating your agendas or preparing your minutes from any of the board meetings or those subcommittee meetings, that you straight away map the agenda items in the minutes against the relevant standard in the HESF. So then it becomes a very easy exercise to go, well, what evidence do we have against each of the standards? It's also really important that you remain current on the TEQSA guidance notes as well, and making sure when they're updated, you're reviewing what documents you have against those guidance notes to make sure you're remaining compliant and you're in line with what is considered best practice. So my takeaway message here is, don't wait for re-registration to start doing these things. It should be continuous. And then when you get to your re-registration process, it is going to make your life so much easier because you'll be confident you have everything in place. It would just be gathering that evidence and doing some final checks. Another pitfall we see with providers preparing for re-registration is they have wonderful policies and procedures, but they have no evidence of implementation. So TEQSA expect that you not only have those documents in place, but you have evidence of that implementation, and also that there's monitoring and reporting on those documents to make sure that they're sufficient and that they're being followed. So now, with that, I'm going to hand over to Claude, who's going to go through the agenda today. Thank you, Claude.
Thank you, Danny. Without any further ado, let's take a look at the specific items that we would like to cover in this submission management webinar about TEQSA re-registration. One of the things that we would like to highlight in this session relates to why is effective and proactive submission management important. We would like to highlight in this session that preparation is key in your submission management, and ideally you would like to commence with your preparation 1 to 2 years prior to your submission date. There is sometimes it's sometimes being underestimated in terms of the volume of work that is involved in the submission of the preparation of your submission. So preparation is really key. Another thing that we would like to highlight is that what does a good submission management look like? And that talks about the several factors that you need to take into consideration in your planning and in the execution of the activities involved in your submission preparation. One of the factors being your stakeholders, like the stakeholders that need to be involved in this process. Another thing that we would like to cover in this session would be the tools that will be used for effective submission management. And we have identified a number of essential tools or non-negotiable ones that we think should help you in your submission management. And that will include the submission roadmap, the submission plan, and also the evidence register. And since DVE has been doing it for a number of times in terms of managing different submission, We've also developed a couple of tools that we think are essential or are useful in your submission management. They aren't really mandatory, but we find it really useful in our submission management as well. And that will include a dashboard and also the implementation register. On why preparation is going to be important, first that we have identified here is that it allows the institution to proactively address compliance gaps. And proactive being the key word there. What that means is that the institution should be able to identify what the gaps are from the compliance perspective at an early stage. The institution should also have sufficient time to be addressing those gaps. And just like what Danny mentioned earlier, you should be able to demonstrate implementation of those specific rectification activities that you will be doing to address those gaps. And that substantiates the time that we have provided earlier, that you have to have at least 1 year of preparation for your submission. Another important thing is that it engages the relevant stakeholders in your implementation activities. And when we talk about relevant stakeholders, that talks about you should be able to answer questions like who should be leading the change, who needs to have input to the changes, who will be doing the legwork, what are the committees that will need to be involved in terms of the endorsement of the documents and the approval of documents as well. And last but not the least, who will be impacted by that output? Whether it's the students, international or domestic, that has to be identified, or it could be your staff as well. Ultimately, appropriate preparation puts the provider in best possible position for a successful TEQSA re-registration. The gold standard here is that 7 years of re-registration without conditions and or voluntary undertaking. On how you'll be able to do that, we have come up with a list here of what good looks like for your submission management. As mentioned earlier, gaps should be identified with a clear implementation plan, and that implementation plan should show you what specific findings have been identified from a compliance gap standpoint. What are the rectification activities that need to be done for those to be addressed? Who's responsible for that? And when does that need to be done? Another thing that we have here in terms of what good looks like is that documents are updated and aligned with the HESF 2021. Just like what Danny mentioned, there were changes with the legislation here. Our team recently attended a conference facilitated by International Education Association of Australia. And the senior advisor of the quality and standards at Monash University provided 4 R's of evidence. And that 4 R's include your documents should be recent, relevant, robust, and readable. Another thing on what would make your submission good is that external experts should be engaged in appropriate areas. May it be in the area of governance, finance, marketing, etc. What best practice is as well when engaging external expert is that a terms of reference has to be developed that is approved by the board before commencing any reviews. In this particular slide that we will be providing you as well, you can see here a link to the TEQSA guide on the list of independent experts that you can refer to. As mentioned, there has to be an appropriate governance and quality oversight that needs to be established, which means that you have to identify the committees that will need to be involved with the endorsement and approval processes. The change and comms plan has to be developed as well that talks about what specific changes need to happen and how that change will be communicated to the impacted stakeholders. Just like what Danny mentioned, what good looks like as well is that preparation for re-registration is not a one-off activity every 7 years. It has to be having or demonstrating continuous improvement culture and practice, which means there has to be regular external referencing, as mentioned, internal audits in the institution as well. So that's pretty much it on what good looks like for your submission management. And Danny will be talking about what the submission team looks like, or submission management team looks like for your submission preparation.
Thank you, Claude. So as you can gather, re-registration applications require a systematic and a whole of institution approach. It can't be one person doing all of the work here. There needs to be multiple stakeholders. And it is crucial that there is stakeholder buy-in for this whole re-registration process, and that the stakeholders understand the importance. One of the pitfalls we see when providers are preparing for re-registration is that it's not seen as a priority. It's put on the back burner for business as usual. So your executive team really need to make sure that your stakeholders understand the importance of this process, that your stakeholders are given time to focus on this and given the support so that business as usual can still continue, but work on re-registration can continue as well. So there's a few ways you can ensure your stakeholders are committed to a successful re-registration for a provider. And one of those ways, it starts well before your re-registration, but it's to ensure your stakeholders understand the company's objectives. And one way of doing that is to actually allow them to have input initially into any planning, such as, helping develop your strategic plan, or, for academics, your teaching and learning plan. By staff having input into those plans, they're more likely to take ownership and have a sense of purpose in accomplishing those plans. And by having that as well, then they're more likely to be invested in making sure the provider gets through its re-registration and the provider meeting its objectives. So any provider that's got their re-registration coming up in the next few years, that should be in their strategic plan as a priority, and that all staff should be working towards and should be communicated with those staff as well. So another way to ensure stakeholders are committed is to start conversations early about re-registration. At a minimum, I would be saying for smaller private providers, maybe at least a year in advance before your application's due, not when your renewal registration expires, when you're actually meant to submit, which is usually 6 months prior to that renewal of registration end date. And for larger providers and universities, I would be starting that even earlier, potentially 2 years in advance, starting those conversations. It's really important as well that you keep everyone up to date on what's happening and giving them regular reports on the progress, and keeping them so they feel involved and they know what's going on. It's really important too that you explain to staff what the outcomes are if the re-registration application is unsuccessful, or if you get conditions, or any of those various outcomes that I'll go into more detail later on in this presentation. But at the same time, you don't want to absolutely scare all your staff into leaving and jumping ship and going elsewhere. You want to motivate them to be part of that re-registration journey, and to give them some pride and some purpose in it, and make them feel like they're going to accomplish something at the end of it, but making it very clear what can possibly happen if it doesn't go well. So the team involved in the re-registration process will be determined by the size and the structure of the provider. So we've got a slide up here, which is an example for a small provider. So for a small provider, usually you'd have someone in an executive leadership position who would be owning this project and having that oversight. So often with small private providers, it's the CEO, or sometimes I've even seen the dean as well. So it really depends on the provider who wants to be in that position. So they will be making sure that the rest of the team's in place, that the re-registration process is kicking off early enough, and they're going to making sure that there's that governance oversight as well, making sure the necessary boards are involved, and that the boards are approving the documents they need to be approving. Then underneath that, you'll often have what we call an implementation or a submission plan manager. So they will be owning sort of your submission plan, your evidence register, which Claude is going to talk through later and give some examples there. And they will be driving everyone else to make sure they are doing what they need to be doing and developing the evidence that they need to be doing. Then they'll get all that together and collate it all and get it ready for submission. So often that person will also look after submitting the documents into the TEQSA portal. Now, underneath that, you're going to have subject matter experts, and they might be internal to the company, or they could be external to the company. Now, they're going to be not necessarily developing all the documents, although some of them may be helping with developing the documents, but they're going to be overseeing the quality and the progress of the evidence. So you might have an external expert who does like a course review for you or something and gives input into the working group that sits below them so that they can modify that evidence and make sure it's in line with best practice and that there's no gaps in compliance. They're also the escalation point if the working group that sits underneath them can't agree on an approach or isn't sure what to do there and give input into that. So then you obviously have your working group, which are your evidence creators. So this team could be very varied. It could be anyone from admissions to your academics, to your compliance team. And they will be working on the various different pieces of evidence and giving their expert input into those documents and helping the implementation and the submission manager understand what documents they have that could be submitted to show compliance against each of the standards. So that's the example for the small HEP. And then on the next slide, we're going to be looking at a larger HEP, which, or this could be universities as well. You'll see it's very similar, but there might be a few extra roles in there because of the size of the institution. So rather than having one person sort of leading this, you might have like a steering group at the top, or you might have a special board or advisory group put together that's going to be leading this project. And they'll have the same responsibilities as the CEO or the dean as the small provider would be. Then underneath that, you have, again, your implementation submission plan manager. But as this is such a big undertaking, they might need administrators that sit underneath them that help them with the gathering of the evidence, checking the file names, all those sorts of things, getting it ready for the uploading into the TEQSA portal. And again, they're making sure that everything's resourced and things are tracking along. You still need your subject matter experts, which will be exactly the same there. Then underneath, rather than just having working groups, what we see with a lot of large providers and universities is they'll have a project team where there's a primary owner. So an example might be for the team developing policies and procedures, they'll have like their director of compliance and governance in charge of the team. And then underneath that, they might have their compliance managers and things who are actually giving the input into the document, and then the working group actually writing the document. So that's all I really wanted to cover here, but it is really important that you figure out early on who your team's going to be, making sure it's resourced, everyone's very clear on their roles and responsibilities, and that everyone's held accountable as well, and that you're having regular check-ins to make sure you're on top of everything. So I'll hand back over to Claude. Thanks, Claude. Oh, you're on mute, Claude.
Thanks, Danny. Now that we know the composition of the submission management team, let's talk about what should happen by when. So we have here a submission roadmap, an example of a submission roadmap that we would like to walk you through in terms of how you would prepare for your submission. Similar to what we have mentioned earlier, what good looks like for your submission management is that gaps are identified at a very early stage, and that's what we're trying to show in here. So you can see here the first stage is really about the readiness. And as to how that's done is that subject matter experts on the relevant areas can be engaged at the early stage to take a look at some key documentation for high-level review. And that high-level review will result in identifying specific areas that you feel like there's high risk of non-compliance. If you identify any of that area that has high risk of non-compliance, you can decide or plan for you to have a specific gap analysis on that particular area, i.e. governance, academic, or courses. We just want to highlight here as well that in terms of gap analysis, it doesn't necessarily stop in this process or in this stage of the submission management. Gap analysis is something that happens all throughout, and even after the submission, you'll still have to do gap analysis. And it allows you to continuously identify gaps that you will have to be rectifying in the spirit of continuous improvement culture. But just for the purpose of the submission management, gap analysis here really relates to areas that you would like to facilitate deep dive analysis on. From the readiness and gap analysis here, you will be able to identify specific rectification activities and also the specific findings that you'll get out of the gap analysis and readiness assessment. The implementation manager will now be responsible for putting together an implementation plan. And what that means is that collating of all these findings and recommendations in one spot and getting some input as well from subject matter experts on what is more important than the other, because it's possible that you'll have heaps of recommendations that will come out of different reviews. From there, the implementation manager can be responsible as well for putting together change and comms plan with some input as well from the leadership team. And that is to develop the change and comms plan here to support the implementation of this particular process. After identifying your implementation activity and developing your change and comms plan, the next step is really for you to start implementing those rectification activities or activities that you have to do for you to address the gaps that have been identified. We have grouped here the specific rectification activities, and that's for a reason, which we'll be talking about as well. So some rectification activities may be relating to governance, accountability, institutional quality assurance. Some could be relating to academic quality, student participation, and representation. We would like to give a great focus here on areas that relate to governance, particularly because if there are significant gaps or issues identified in the governance area, that would usually flow to other areas as well. There could be some instances where TEQSA would be reviewing your governance-related documentation in your submission, and when they identify significant gaps in that particular area, you would usually get an adverse decision straight away without having the rest of these things being reviewed, because again, significant issues in the governance could flow to other areas. Once you go through the implementation activities, prioritizing the high priority ones, obviously, you'll be able to collate documents being developed out of those implementation activities. So you'll have to collate different documentation and also prepare those for submission. One of the activities as well that you will have to do is writing of your overviews. And what that is that it's the narrative that you want to tell TEQSA in terms of the evidence that you're including in your submission. It talks about how those evidence items are actually supporting your compliance against the standards. We recommend for this to be written early and not at the end, just so for the implementation manager to be able to identify if there are any gaps in the narrative and for you to be able to identify if there are additional steps that would have to be done to fill the gaps. After that, what we recommend as best practice as well is that you do a mock assessment of your submission. And what the mock assessment is that it's getting an independent expert that's not involved at all in this process to review the submission as TEQSA would. And that would give you a sense of the potential outcome of your submission. So that's the mock assessment right there. After the mock assessment in your plan, you should be able to take into consideration as well some time for you to be able to rectify any gaps that will be identified out of the mock assessment. You will go through the submission, which is uploading of the evidence items to the TEQSA portal. We'll go through the registration and you'll get the outcome from TEQSA. What we don't want to forget here, as mentioned earlier, is that we have to take into consideration the maintenance or the culture, the continuous improvement culture that has to be implemented as well. And again, that talks about regular audits, external referencing that will have to be done. If there are any changes with the legislation as well, that should trigger a review internally to review the relevant areas to make sure that you remain compliant with the standards. Here's another view of that roadmap, and this time it's in a Gantt chart view. So you can see here that you would again start with initial readiness assessment. From initial readiness assessment, again, you could come up with some areas that you would want to do specific reviews on or deep dive analysis. For this particular example, we've added some additional gap analysis or reviews relating to course. You can see here that we have internal comprehensive review as well, external individual course review. And we're planning for this example, a corporate and academic governance review somewhere in the plan here. Once you have identified the gaps from the initial readiness assessment, come up with an overarching implementation plan. And you can see here that this is going to be an intensive coordination in terms of collation of the evidence, ensuring that things are happening based on the plan. You can also see here that you have to take into consideration the approval of those documentations. So you have to take a look at the committees that will have to be involved in the endorsement and approval process. Any operational documentation or academic evidence will have to go through appropriate approval processes as well with the relevant boards, depending on your governance framework and your delegations. You can see here that overviews will have to be developed at some point here. It shouldn't be at the late part of your preparation. It should be drafted early. And then you can see here that you will receive the confirmed evidence table from TEQSA 6 months before your submission date. What the confirmed evidence table is it's a list of standards that you will be required to provide evidence of compliance. The minimum set of standards that you will see in your confirmed evidence table will relate to the core standards, which you can refer to TEQSA as to what the core standards are. One institution can also have a different confirmed evidence table, and that's because there could be some areas that TEQSA would require evidence for, and that's referred to as core plus areas. Now, you could also prepare for your core plus areas, depending on the previous TEQSA risk assessment that you would have received, or any RFIs or request for information that you've had from TEQSA in the past. At this stage, you can see that all evidence has been approved by the relevant boards. The draft submission should be completed as well at this stage. You'll have to collate the documentation before the mock assessment, and you'll go through the mock assessment process. You can see here that we have allotted time as well for you to be able to do a rectification or rectification activities post the mock assessment, depending on the gaps that will be identified post this activity. You can see here as well that you'll have to collate the documents again after the mock assessment if you do some changes on those. And then you may be doing some updates as well on your overviews following your rectification activities after the mock assessment. At this stage, you can see that the submission should be complete, including the application templates that you have to populate. The submission has to be approved as well by the boards, i.e. our academic board and also the corporate board. And you can see here on month 12 that the submission is submitted to TEQSA. Now, we have shown you the roadmap, which is again the high-level view of the things that you'll have to do in your submission preparation. The other version of that is the project plan, which is really the expanded version of your project roadmap or submission roadmap that talks about the specific activities or tasks that will have to be completed by who, by when, and the specific actions that you have to make sure that will have to be completed for your submission preparation. From your project plan, you will have their specific reviews again that you will have to be conducting, and that's going to have some evidence that will have to be developed or rectified. What we recommend as well is that you come up with an evidence register, which is a list of evidence items that you plan to submit for your submission that are mapped against different standards. It is also possible for you to see an evidence item that's mapped to multiple standards, which we will be showing to you in a few. One tool that we have come up with, or we have developed, because again, we have been doing this for numerous times, although it's not mandatory and it's just optional, is what we refer to as an implementation register. What it does is that it collates all of the findings and recommendations in one spot for us to be able to track the implementation activities individually. What we found is that a specific evidence item or a specific document can have multiple gaps against it. And for us to be able to monitor those individually in terms of each implementation action, we monitor that in the implementation register. But if you would like to have a very, very simple setup, that's also possible to just have the evidence register, and then each evidence item under that, you can specify which rectification activity will have to be done for each document. We've also developed, which is optional here, a dashboard that can show you as to where things are at a first glance, if things are in progress, if things are behind in terms of your submission preparation as well. This slide will show you the specific team member who will be accessing those tools depending on the activities that will have to be done. In terms of your submission roadmap, that can be used by your leadership, by your steering group, or by your board. The submission roadmap is intentionally on a one page. You can print it out, you can post it on a wall and use it as a reference as to where things should be at. The submission plan is something that is, again, detailed version of the roadmap, and that's used by the implementation manager. And that's for the implementation manager to ensure that the approval is tracking well, the coordination is on track as well, or the evidence collation is on track. And this is a spot as well where the implementation manager could see if expert advice is required on a specific area. The evidence register, again, would be the list of evidence mapped against the HESF. And the ones who would usually use it for small HEP, it's going to be the implementation manager. For larger organizations, it's going to be implementation manager and administrator. And what that does, again, is that it allows you to see or manage or coordinate the evidence required for the submission. It takes a look as well to the evidence development that's happening in this process. The implementation register, which is an optional tool, has the list of all implementation activities based on the gaps identified, and it's the implementation manager and administrator who will be using that. And it tracks, again, the evidence development and the expert advice that will have to be provided on those gaps that were identified in the gap analysis. I'll be showing you now the specific tools that we use. Let me just share my screen here. So now that we have seen the submission roadmap, I'm going to show you an example of a more detailed version of that, which is the submission plan. So you can see here, it's been grouped, the activities have been grouped into planning, execution, monitoring, and closing. You may have a different structure in your submission plan, but for us, planning means key roles have been identified in your submission preparation. You'll need to set up the submission plan. You can see there who's responsible as well. When does it need to be done by, and the percentage complete or the status of that specific item. You'll need to identify the appropriate meetings that will have to be set up as well for the submission management to make sure that there is an appropriate oversight of the progress of the submission preparation. You could set up your implementation register, which is optional, set up your evidence register, communicate roles and responsibilities to the team, and then confirm key dates which relate to the key dates of the board meetings, the academic board meetings, the corporate board meetings, or any committees that will have to be involved in the endorsement. Under execution here, you can see that, again, we start with the initial readiness assessment, and you can see that is done by a subject matter expert. The collation of the documents required for that review can be done by the implementation manager or administrator for larger organizations. Under implementation here, you can see different sections that relate to evidence development. Now, we have grouped here the evidence items into different categories such as policies, procedures, governance, forms, etc. Now, it's just high level here in terms of the actions that we have added on specific evidence category. Say, for example, for policies and procedures, one of the key steps would be identifying the policies and procedures that will be required for your submission. And then the next step here would be for the working groups to develop the policies and procedures. Now, the detailed list of the policies and procedures can sit in your evidence register just to make sure that this doesn't get a lot busy. And then you can see here the review activities or specific reviews that you can do in your submission preparation. That could relate to governance, that could relate to your courses as well. You have a section here to monitor the percentage complete or the status of the implementation items that you have in your submission preparation. And then you have to take into consideration as well the meeting dates of your corporate board, academic board, and any other committees that will have to be involved for endorsement. It is best practice to get some consultation or expert advice again on different areas, on relevant areas. And you can see here that mock assessment, we have steps there as well. You have to assume that you're submitting to TEQSA. And then you can see here that you have to write the overview. Someone will have to conduct the mock assessment, which will be with the subject matter expert. Some administrative actions as well for preparation for submission. That includes the overviews, any administration that has to be completed in terms of the forms that you have to complete. And then you can see here that you have to have a complete review checklist of the evidence items as well. Operational preparation, this talks about the staff details. It's the staff updating their CVs. It's a website audit as well. And then you can see here for submission, any other administrative tasks that will have to be done either by the implementation manager or the administrator. And then you can see that it has to be approved in terms of the overall submission. It has to be approved by the board. And this one talks about loading it to the actual portal, which again can be done by administrator or implementation manager. We've also taken into consideration the continuous improvement culture that has to be established. So we have here the maintenance activities as well. And you can see here it's ongoing. It doesn't necessarily have an end date in your submission preparation. You have there the ongoing quality education activities, any review of the quality culture and plan improvements, and the review of your quality framework. If there's any reporting that you have to do to the board or to the leadership in terms of the progress of the submission preparation as well, you can identify which specific reporting requirements you'll have to establish for your submission preparation. And some of the closing activities have been added in here as well. So that's the submission plan. And this is just to show you the expanded version of that submission roadmap that we have shown you earlier. Another tool that we have said is going to be essential for your submission management is what we refer to as evidence register. Again, it's a list of the evidence items that you would like to include in your submission based on your confirmed evidence table. So you can see here under policies and procedures, we have added a couple of examples of policies and procedures that may be included for the submission. Now we have grouped it in this manner, and we haven't grouped it by domain because we find that one evidence item, again, can be used across different domains or different standards as an evidence. But what you can see here is that each evidence item, say this policy and procedure, has been mapped to the relevant standards, just so you know that this evidence item right here will be used as evidence for standard 1, 2, 5, 6, 7 against the relevant HESF that you can see here. For you to be able to identify what specific policies and procedures or specific evidence items that you'll have to add here, what we recommend is that you go to the core standards available on the TEQSA website and you try to map different documentation that you currently have against those standards for you to be able to come up with a unique list of the evidence items that you'll have to put together for the submission. So that's what the evidence register is. There are some other features that we have added to the evidence register, such as the specific name of your document, the link to the document that has to be submitted or rectified or developed. And then you can build in here some content status as to where that is at. Is it being checked for QA? Is it ready for governance approval? Is it ready for submission? You can also add in here the specific implementation activity, i.e. the gaps identified against this specific evidence item. Again, you can just use the evidence register to monitor all of those gaps. If you find it difficult to track multiple gaps against one evidence item, then you can take a look at using the implementation register as well, which is optional. The implementation manager can take a look at the progress comments here, can add comments as to where things are at. You will be able to map these evidence items to the primary owner who's responsible in rectifying or development of this particular evidence item. You have to take into consideration the endorsing committees. If there are multiple, you'll have to identify that. When does it need to be endorsed by? The approving bodies will have to be identified as well. When does it need to be approved by? And then you have a little checklist here for your quality check, just to make sure that you're confident with the evidence items that you're including in your submission. And that would include, has this been reviewed by a subject matter expert? What is the proposed file name for submission? Now, TEQSA has guidance notes in terms of the title of the documents that you will be submitting for your documentation. The title itself should be telling as to what it is. As an example, in your confirmed evidence table, you should add admissions policy and procedures instead of adding admin or AD PNP. So that won't make sense to the assessor. So just make sure that the document name is telling of what it is. So you can see here as well, the template has been checked. Some checklists that you can have in your submission as well. Have you checked the related documents? Have you checked the name? Did you check the hyperlinks in the documentation? Are they working? Is the file size less than 10 MB? So when you upload a file to the TEQSA portal, it doesn't accept anything that's more than 10 MB, something to take note of. Has it been confirmed as a reference in the overview? Confirmed reference in the evidence table? You can add here the final PDF or URL of the evidence that you will upload to the TEQSA portal. And then you can have a checklist here of, has it been loaded to the portal, which is really at the end part of your submission preparation, because this is about you uploading now the documents to the TEQSA portal. Now that is the evidence register that we have. I'm just going to show you an example of the implementation register, which is again an optional tool, but just to give you a feel of what it looks like. So in this implementation register, we can collate, or we do collate from our end at least, all of the findings and recommendations that we are able to obtain from different reviews that are happening. So you can add here the specific task that needs to be done. What was the specific issue that was identified? What is the evidence or relevant document that will have to be updated or developed to be able to address that finding? Some content status for you to be able to know where things are at. And then we have included here as well some traffic light system. And then you can be getting, implementation items or findings and recommendations from different areas. So we just added a column here that relates to, identifying which specific review the recommendation has come from. That's the implementation register. And this is just to show you the dashboard that we have put together as well, for us to be able to know at the first glance where things are at, if things are on track, and what's the status of the submission preparation. You can see here some information about the percentage complete of the submission plan. And you can see here the activities that have yet to be completed or in progress or completed in your submission plan. In this widget right here, you can see the status of the evidence items being developed from not started until you see everything going into ready for submission every time that you would update your evidence register. And then you can see here that we have built a widget as well for the implementation register, which is just to track as well the implementation activities with the traffic light system and some of the milestones that we have identified from that submission plan that we have put together. Lastly, I'd like to show you an example of a confirmed evidence table. Just like what we mentioned earlier, there is a TEQSA guidance note in terms of naming your documents that will be added for your submission in the confirmed evidence table. You can see here that it's clear it's for admissions policy. It doesn't have any abbreviation at this stage. It says admissions policy, and you can either add a suffix or a prefix to that particular evidence item. And every time that you would be using admissions policy to different sections of the confirmed evidence table where you think that's going to be used in evidence for, you can be consistent with your naming. You can use admissions policy ID 001 all throughout. The reason as well why you have to add the evidence item against multiple sections of the confirmed evidence table where you think it's relevant to that particular section is that it's possible that when you send your submission to TEQSA, each domain will be split into different assessors in terms of reviewing your compliance in a specific domain. It's uncommon for you to find someone who's expert on all areas. That's why that happens. Just to avoid any request for information or RFIs post your submission, make sure that you map against the specific documentation to the relevant section, regardless if it's redundant or you've entered it multiple times already. So that's pretty much it in terms of the tools that we use in the submission management, the ones that we say that are non-negotiable or we think are really essential, and the ones that we think are additional tools but really helpful as well. I'm going to give it back to Danny because now that we know how things are going to be run, let's talk about what are the possible outcomes and next steps from here.
Thank you, Claude. So the outcome you're all going to be aiming for is to get re-registered with the full 7 years, no conditions. But if you don't get this right and you don't submit the right evidence, then TEQSA could come back to you initially with a letter advising what they're proposing is their decision. They give you a chance to respond. And in that letter, they might detail either they could be giving you conditions. So conditions are made publicly available on the TEQSA National Register. And I would highly recommend that if you're preparing for re-registration, you review those conditions for other providers because you'll get some very key learnings out of there and where other providers have perhaps had lapses in compliance. Another possible outcome is voluntary undertakings, which is something we're seeing a lot more of these days. So voluntary undertakings, very similar to conditions where you might need to report on things to TEQSA, but they don't make those publicly available. Now, while they're called voluntary undertakings, if you don't do what TEQSA asks, it's going to become a condition. So you're advised if you get a voluntary undertaking to make sure you do exactly what they're asking for and meet those deadlines. Another possible outcome is that you could receive a shortened re-registration duration. Now, you obviously don't want this because it could mean that your team are exhausted and you might almost have to start that process immediately again, preparing to submit everything again. So you want the longest possible duration. The worst possible outcome is that TEQSA could decide that they're not going to re-register you at all. You obviously do not want that. It's not very often that we see that happen, but it is a possibility, particularly if there's inadequate governance or if there's any financial issues or anything like that. if you get any of these outcomes that, you know, are adverse, that you don't agree with, and you're given that opportunity to reply to TEQSA, but it's unsuccessful, your next avenue is to appeal to TEQSA, not to TEQSA, to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, or the AAT, which you want to avoid, because at that stage you're going to have to get lawyers involved and it can become very, very costly. So it's much better to invest in this re-registration process from the beginning and get it right the first time around. Don't take any shortcuts. Don't assume you can submit exactly what you did last time. Take on board the feedback from your external reviewers. And, you know, if you don't agree with all of the feedback, make sure that you document that and why you don't agree with it and what you've done instead and why you still believe you meet the higher education standards framework requirements. So from here, the next steps, preparing for your re-registration, is make sure you prepare well in advance. Do a self-assessment against the higher education threshold standards to identify any gaps. Don't wait for your confirmed evidence table from TEQSA that comes 6 months before. Get working on making sure you've mapped evidence to demonstrate compliance with all standards so that you're prepared for TEQSA to ask for absolutely anything. And yeah, making sure you're reviewing the conditions on the TEQSA National Register as well. The main reason we see conditions is normally around corporate and academic governance. Once submitted, it doesn't end there. Make sure you're preparing for your site visit. TEQSA will usually do a site visit in person. With COVID, they have changed and they're getting people to do virtual sort of tours of the campus, where you might be on an iPad or something and showing them around. As things are opening up, they might start doing face-to-face visits again. Ensure all your staff understand the higher education threshold standards and they understand the policies and procedures relevant to their areas. You know, once all the evidence is submitted, don't leave it at that. If you know there's gaps, keep rectifying, keep refining your evidence. Any of your rectification plans, you know, or your findings from your external, internal reviews, keep working towards addressing them. It often will take TEQSA, you know, up to a year to get back to you with an outcome. In that time, you can keep developing your evidence and be in a much better position if they come back with an adverse decision to respond to them and say, well, we've done all of this. This is now our updated evidence, to try and reverse that adverse decision. And make sure you keep reporting on progress to the relevant boards as well of your institution, and keeping them up to date on what's happening, and regularly reporting against your rectification plans. So that is it for today. So thank you everyone for attending. We're now going to give you a chance to ask any questions and we'll be answering those. So I'll hand over to Anne, who's going to go through those questions, and Claude and I will be answering those for you.
Thanks so much, Danny and Claude. That was excellent. I hope that comprehensive presentation really gave a good impression of how much work and, you know, effort and time it takes to prepare a submission and a good re-registration application. So in terms of the questions, we do receive 2 so far. If anyone has any more, please do type them in now. The first one was, are TEQSA using the risk assessment results in re-registration evidence requirements / assessments?
Absolutely, that could be something that determines what evidence they ask for. So TEQSA will take into consideration the provider's level of risk, which will determine whether they need to give evidence against the core only or the extension to the core where they ask for additional things. And one way they identify what they might be requiring is that risk assessment, and if there's been any gaps. It could be other things as well, based on information from RFIs. It might be just that there's a perceived risk in the industry. So, you know, not long ago in the media was around admissions and some issues there with students being admitted because of insufficient English language requirements. So it might be that they focus on that, even though it's not a perceived level of risk for your provider. They just want to make sure that the industry as a whole is on top of everything. So there's several things that can impact exactly what evidence you need to provide.
Thank you. The next question was, and this is a very good question. So is the evidence register available for use? So that's a very good question. Thank you, Wing, for asking, and I can answer this one. So we are sending a simplified copy of the evidence register that we showed you earlier as a kind of a thank you for everyone who attended today. So do keep an eye on your email. But of course, it is just a simplified version. But if you do want to kind of know more about the extended and detailed version that Claude has gone through, or about any of the support services or how DVE can help to manage the extensive application for re-registration, do contact us and we will have the contact details at the end. But yes, you will receive a simpler version of this at the end of the session. The next question was impact of an institution having several TNE locations when re-registering with TEQSA.
So I guess for this one, TEQSA might be interested in looking at how you ensure compliance for each of those TNE locations. So it's really important that you have quality assurance processes around those locations, that you're making sure that at each of those locations, they're meeting the HESF requirements still, that there's consistency in the operations across the institution as a whole, and everyone's doing things consistently. You should have policies and procedures in place around managing those and evidence of reporting against those as well to your boards and things.
Thank you, Danny. The next question was Zori. Hello, Zori. Have you seen any trends in extension evidence requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. There are some trends. We're finding that a lot of providers lately will need to give additional evidence against standard 1 around admissions. Also, again, because it's a sort of a focal point for TEQSA as well around sexual assault, sexual harassment and safety and well-being, we're finding that TEQSA are asking for additional evidence above the core in those sorts of areas as well. And domain 7 is the other area where we're finding TEQSA are often asking for additional information around the approach to agent management and managing your marketing material and those sorts of things.
Excellent. The next question is from Wing again. So what has been your experience in the use of guidance notes as a mandatory statement rather than guidance as noted in the guidance notes?
Yeah, so the guidance notes are just there to help you. They're not a legislative instrument. You are not expected to do everything within the guidance note, but they're there for a reason to help you. So if you have another system in place or another way of doing things, that's absolutely fine, but you need to be able to ensure TEQSA that you still meet the higher education threshold requirements and that, you know, what you're doing is working. So yeah, if you don't do something in a guidance note for whatever reason, making sure you're justifying that. Again, I'd be even taking that to your board, getting them to discuss it, what they're doing. So it's documented, give TEQSA that confidence that you've looked at the guidance note, you understand the requirements, but you've got a different way of doing things, which is absolutely fine. TEQSA doesn't expect that every single provider is going to be the same and has the same way of doing things. It's there for your benefit to help you and to guide you on ways to ensure compliance with the higher education threshold standards.
The next question is from Liz. For dual providers, how much sharing of information occurs between ASCA and TEQSA for re-registrations?
They're definitely talking a lot more these days than they used to. And they are sharing information, and we are seeing that is happening a lot more these days. As to what they're sharing, I couldn't comment on. But particularly around your board and things, or any of your directors or shareholders or anything, they're sharing information there around whether they're fit and proper or anything like that. Or ASC would share if, you know, for your vet provider, you got any conditions or anything like that with TEQSA, and then they might dig into those areas that were uncovered for the vet provider as a gap in compliance and see is the same occurring in the higher education space. So they do share information.
Thank you. And the next question was from Sonia. Do you know what an excellent re-registration submission looks like, and has there been any recently?
This is a tough one to answer because it's going to depend on your provider. Every provider has different evidence and different ways of doing things. But I guess an excellent re-registration submission is giving TEQSA the evidence that they're asking for, making sure there's consistency in your evidence as well. We see that there's a policy and procedure and they'll submit something else that contradicts what's in their policy and procedure, making sure everything's aligned, making sure your overviews tell that story and pull together your evidence. And as Claude was talking about the 4 R's before of evidence, making sure that you have those 4 R's, which were, Claude, do you remember them off the top of your head? Recent, relevant, readable, that's the one. So yeah, so making sure all your evidence meets those requirements. What we see as well is sometimes, the TEQSA might ask for your policy and procedure on dealing with sexual assault and sexual harassment, as an example, and the provider will just give that, but there's so many interlinked policies and procedures. For instance, your critical incident policy and procedure should talk about, well, if there is a SASH instance, how do you deal with it? How do you report it and document all that? So submitting all of the relevant documents, but keeping it relevant, but not giving them the bare minimum either. You need to be able to give them enough information so they can make a judgment on compliance.
I think, Danny, one of the things as well, based on one of the things that we have learned in the past is that there isn't a perfect institution. There could be some gaps, really. And what's important is that when you do your submission, you have a clear plan as to how those gaps are going to be addressed, and that the corporate board or the governing body should be on top of those gaps in terms of rectification as well.
Thank you both. So the last 2 questions, and this is your final chance to submit anything that you would like to ask us. So where do I locate detailed findings from other providers regarding non-compliances? So far, I could only find non-detailed.
Yeah, so you won't get the very detailed findings. They're confidential unless you have a relationship with that provider and they're willing to disclose that information to you. On the TEQSA National Register, if you look for the institution, or have a summary high level of the risk. So it might talk around, your governance and the specific HESF that they were non-compliant with, but it won't go into the exact details of what those risks were. So yeah, it's high level to give you a guide as to what went wrong, but you won't get the specifics without knowing someone at that institution who's willing to share that information with you, unfortunately.
And the final question is, what are the 4 R's again, please? Could you let us know?
You're on mute, Claude.
Those 4 R's, your document should be recent, they should be relevant, they should be robust, and they should be readable.
Oh, we just had one more last minute question. All right, so just last one. Examples of best practices that we can follow.
This is where your external referencing comes in and your benchmarking. We can't give you a best practice example of every single document, unfortunately, because there's hundreds of different documents and everyone does it slightly differently. So making sure you're looking against other comparable providers and other universities and things like that to see what they're doing and to determine what's best practice. Your board as well should be giving input into what they've seen and what's best practice. They're often on multiple boards at different providers, looking at those TEQSA guidance notes for what they consider best practice. Managing your submission. Obviously, we've given you today a rundown of what we consider the best practice tools, and we will be sharing with you some samples today. And obviously, if you need any help with populating those submission tools or anything like that, DVE can help. If you've got any specific questions around a particular piece of evidence, then you want some advice on what is best practice, again, if you contact DVE, we can give you that more specific advice. But yeah, there's lots of different evidence that to go through what's considered best practice for all of them, and this would take me days, unfortunately.
Excellent. So that's probably a good segue, Danny, to what's next. So Again, thank you so much for everyone who attended today and actually stayed on till the end. We really appreciate your time. So if this presentation have kind of sparked more questions and answers for you, but we do hope that we answered some of your questions. And if you need further advice or you would like a further consultation session with us, so we do offer 2 1-hour free advisory sessions to the first 2 organizations who reach out to us to book this in. So you can see the contact detail there, info@dvesolutions.com.au on the slide. So feel free to reach out to us and just say that this is just part of the webinar that you've attended, and we will be able to reach out and book that in for you to sit in with one of our consultants. But if you do want to find out also more about this, in general, the support services that DVE can provide in governance and compliance, re-registration, evidence register, anything like that, do contact us by the same contact email. But yes, thank you so much again for your time today, and thank you to Danielle and Claude for your excellent presentation. I hope you leave with more, information and kind of more tools to arm yourself for a very important deadline for everyone. Thank you so much and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone, and good luck with your re-registrations.